Hello and welcome to another video review. This is the remake of Rise of the Triad for PC. This is a first-person shooter developed by Interceptor Entertainment and published by Apogee Software back in July of 2013, and it's interesting because this wasn't really something we expected, and moreover, this was at a time when remakes weren't exactly a good thing. So we were pretty much expecting this thing to be crap from the get-go, because not only was it a game that, while popular in its day, isn't all that remembered these days, but it's a remake when we'd had things that, like the previous year with Syndicate, where it basically had nothing to do with the original. So then the remake itself gets a very mixed reception when it actually comes out, and the question really becomes, does this thing follow in the footsteps of the original and really feel like it's supposed to, or does it do something else entirely and maybe fail in the process? Before we really get into the meat of the game, let's first talk about the presentation, but you do have to keep something in mind. Interceptor Entertainment is a very small team, so their capabilities are pretty limited from the get-go, but this thing does run on Unreal Engine 3, and while it does have some decent effects here and there, and in particular the explosions look rather nice, the texture quality is not particularly great. A lot of the modeling looks rather basic and not all that well detailed. The animations are downright crap in most cases, and it really does look like a game that came out a couple of years prior to when it actually did. And not only that, but its looks really don't justify its performance. On my GTX 970 and i7 4790K, I should be getting ridiculously high frame rates, and for the most part, it's over 100 FPS, but there's quite a lot of moments where it will drop below 60 frames a second, and I have no idea why. So if it has issues on my hardware, then it's going to have issues if your hardware is older than what I've got. And this was a major complaint when the game came out. It ran like crap, and even if you had a beastly rig, it would struggle to get a constant 60 frames a second all the time. Since then, they've patched it quite a lot, in fact, and it's definitely running a lot better now, but there are still some issues, particularly when there's a lot of things on screen at once, or if there's an explosion that's sending giblets everywhere. So that is something to keep in mind. Then there's the sound design, which is kind of all over the place. On the one hand, you have voice acting, which is cheesy and ridiculous, and actually kind of annoying. Your protagonist in the original Rise of the Triad, regardless of who you picked, was relatively quiet. I mean, they would grunt and things like that, but they wouldn't constantly try to say supposedly funny things. But in this particular game, your character never shuts up. And frankly, that gets pretty annoying, particularly if you're playing as certain characters who really aren't as funny as they might think they are. And so you end up with characters like Lorelei, who is a fun character to play because she's so damn fast, but she also has some of the lamest things that she says. For example, you'll pick up a bazooka and she'll say, "I do bad things to bad people."
I do bad things to bad.
And so you just sit there like, okay? But luckily, other parts of the voice acting are just meant to be stupid and ridiculous, and they work out okay. For example, when you slaughter enemies, they have the most corny groans of death you pretty much will hear in an FPS. They just go, "Oh!" and then they explode, and things like that. So, at least you can get some chuckles out of that, but by and large, if you're talking about the characters that you're playing and how they never shut up, that gets pretty irritating. But luckily, the sound effects and the, especially music, make up for this by a considerable degree. The sound effects are nice and beefy, particularly with regards to the heavy weapons that you get. But even the pistols sound pretty powerful, and the machine gun has some nice chunkiness to it. But really what steals the show here is, of course, the music. Andrew Hulsholt did the music for this, and he basically just remixed tracks from the original game. And in fact, you can actually switch it to classic mode for the audio, and it will actually play the original Rise of the Triad music. So that's a nice touch. But The new music is also very nice because it takes that old classic Rise of the Triad music and it throws a metal spin on it. And it works brilliantly, in fact. There are a few tracks here and there that aren't quite as good as the originals, but it's all very, very solid and it works very well. So both the sound effects and the music definitely make up for the rather annoying voice acting, so you can certainly put up with it. I just recommend lowering the voice volume because it gets pretty loud. But ultimately what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, because that's really what mattered in the original game and what made me actually rather enjoy that game. So when you get to this one, the plot is pretty much exactly the same as Rise of the Triad's original plot, where you play as a member of the Hunt, the high-risk United Nations task force, and you're sent to San Nicolas Island to investigate a cult known as the Triad. And of course, shit hits the fan and you have to annihilate the entire cult. Don't you just love 90s game stories? But there's basically no plot here. It's a completely absurd and ridiculous game, and it revels in it. So what it really comes down to is, of course, the gameplay, which is pretty much like the original game in most respects. You start out with a basic pistol. You can eventually pick up a submachine gun and dual pistols, which all have infinite ammo, in fact. They do have a reload button if you just want to play the reload animation, but you don't need to reload because you have infinite ammunition, so what you do need to actually worry about ammo for is your heavy weapons, like you're starting out with a basic bazooka kind of thing, which it just calls a rocket launcher. In the original game it was a bazooka. Heat seekers, flame walls, which are just wonderful, and you get all sorts of these crazy explosive weapons, with some new ones, in fact, which is very nice. But you also get access to things like the Dark Staff, which is insane, and crazy wild power-ups like God Mode, where you now have the ability to just launch these insta-kill projectiles, and you're immune to damage. Now, in the original game, it also made you basically 10 feet tall, and it was hilarious. But in this one, it doesn't make you 10 feet tall, which is a bit of a disappointment, but oh well. It still gives you all the same power anyway. So, you get your God Mode, you get your Dog Mode, which is basically God Mode, only you turn into a dog, and it's hilarious. And there's other power-ups and power-downs, like Shrooms Mode, where the screen starts wobbling all over the place, and though people returning from the original game will actually notice that the Shrooms mode doesn't last as long as it used to in the original game, which is a good thing. It could actually get kind of nauseating in the original game, and in this one in particular, since you're moving so fast, it actually is fairly nauseating, so it's good that they don't have it last very long. There's also things like Elasto mode, where you'll pick up the power down and you'll start bouncing all over the place because you're basically turned into rubber. And it's just this kind of blatant, silly, ridiculous nonsense that made the original game so entertaining. It does not take itself remotely seriously, and this one is no exception. You're constantly hearing them spout one-liners that are just awful. You're constantly seeing these guys explode into ludicrous jibs. You're seeing eyeballs splatter on the screen because of it, which is something that happened in the original game, I might add. You got these massive floating coins that you can pick up for extra points. Yes, this actually has points, believe it or not. And it's all just played as a straight-up game. It's definitely in the spirit of the original game. They do change some things up, however. The level designs are not the same. And that's to be expected. They couldn't manage the same kind of stuff running on the Unreal Engine. So while you will run into a lot of areas that are very familiar, at the same time you'll run into a lot of areas that are brand new. Not all of the new areas are particularly great, I have to say, but the game does flow a lot better than the original because they actually adhered to principles of level design as opposed to just kind of throwing you in this massive level with a lot of secrets in it and just saying, go for it. That's not to say that this doesn't have secret areas. It does in fact have secret areas and secret levels. And some of them are even throwbacks to the original game. You'll have the original textures from the game on the walls and things like that. And it's just really nice to see things like that. This attention to detail, this attention to the original game, and they are very, very clear fans of the original game that were making this thing. That definitely comes across when you're actually playing it. It feels like Rise of the Triad. Unfortunately, this also comes with some problems, because the original Rise of the Triad certainly had some issues too. For example, jumping puzzles. There are a lot of them, and they are really, really annoying. Jumping puzzles have never been good in any FPS ever, and Rise of the Triad had several of them. You had jump pads that you can get on, and those would launch you into the sky, basically. But in this one, not only do you have those, you also have a jump button, and they make liberal use of both of these things. And it gets really irritating when you go into an area and get stuck on a jumping puzzle for the next 5-10 minutes. Yes, I've had jumping puzzles get me stuck for about 10 minutes as I kept falling off of the damn thing. And honestly, if this was like the original release of Rise of the Triad, where they didn't patch in quick saving and quick loading, I probably would have given up on it entirely, because it runs on a checkpoint system, and the checkpoints are fairly few and far between. This is not the kind of game where you put checkpoint saves in. This is the kind of game where you give them a save anywhere option and quick save and quick load. Luckily, they patched in quick save and quick load, so when I actually got around to playing this thing, I had that functionality available to me, and it's a lifesaver. But you can't quick save at certain points. For example, you can't save on moving platforms. This includes elevators, but also those moving platforms that you'll see just floating around. You can't save during boss fights. You can't save if you're in the air, things like that. And so you have to be pretty careful with actually where you save. And my recommendation is to save constantly, because this game is hard. I only played this thing on the normal difficulty, and it regularly handed me my ass. It's not an easy game in the slightest. And unfortunately, a lot of that difficulty isn't even fair difficulty. You'll have a lot of situations where you'll be just going through a level and it will throw a ton of traps at you. In fact, this is the majority of the way you'll die, where it will basically launch some fire streams, and you'll look and you'll see the area clear after the fire stream has gone. But the hitbox hasn't gone away yet, so you'll walk through and you'll take fire damage. And unless you have the asbestos armor, it actually does a lot of damage. It doesn't do any if you have the asbestos, but if you don't have it, you're pretty much gone, even if you're at full health. Luckily, you still have the health system from the original game, which is to say that you eat food, and unlike in the original, you can actually heat up monk meal now, so that will actually give you some extra health, but you still need to find the food in the first place, and considering how many traps are in this game and how many enemies it throws at you, that can be easier said than done. Hell, it even starts throwing enforcers at you in episode 1, and at that point you're just like, wait, what? Enforcers in episode 1? Because in the original Rise of the Triad, it started throwing those at you much later on in the game. You had basically played it for a considerable degree of time. You had all three of your bullet weapons. You probably had plenty of experience by that point. And then it throws enforcers at you, which have heavy machine guns and can throw grenades at you. So when you get to this one and it starts throwing those at you fairly early on, it ratchets up the difficulty very, very quickly. And when you get later on in the game, it only gets worse, because then you start running into robots that can take ridiculous amounts of damage, even from the heaviest explosive weapons. And it gets frankly kind of unfair. So this is definitely not for the faint of heart. In fact, there's really only one demographic I can recommend this to, and that is Rise of the Triad fans. If you liked the original, you will probably like this game. If you didn't like the original, you probably won't like this game. That said, it is a bit of a different playstyle because it is a fully 3D game as opposed to a 2.5D game like the original. and so it's faster, it requires a lot more precision, so you do have to keep all of that in mind. And then of course there's boss fights too, which I got stuck on the first boss fight because it was just kind of brutal. If you look at it from a design standpoint, it actually wasn't all that hard of a boss fight. It's just that the amount of damage this guy did was downright insane, and the constant having to duck back into side areas to pick up more bazookas did not really help. So, again, I really have to recommend it only for Rise of the Triad fans. It's not a bad game by any stretch of the imagination, but it's made for a very specific fan base, and it shows. Both in the good areas, in the sheer amount of love put into this thing, which is very obvious, and in the not so great areas where it adheres a bit too much to the old school Rise of the Triad. So that's ultimately why I'm giving this a 3 out of 5. Just remember, if you are a fan of Rise of the Triad, you will probably like this. I certainly like it, even though it pisses me off quite a lot. Thanks for watching.